Richard Boone was known to the world as a man carved from stone, a towering presence with a thunderous voice, a face that seemed permanently set in defiance, and an intensity that made audiences believe he was born hard and unbreakable. For decades, viewers saw him as Paladin, the cool-headed gunfighter of Have Gun, Will Travel, or as the commanding authority figure in countless westerns and war films. He was Hollywood's definition of toughness, the man who never flinched, never begged, never bent. But behind that carefully maintained image was a private life that almost no one truly understood. For more than 30 years, Richard Boone lived a double life, one that even those closest to him only partially grasped. It wasn't a life of crime or scandal in the tabloid sense. It was something quieter, more complex, and far more painful. It was a life defined by intellectual hunger, deep insecurity, private demons, and a constant internal war between who he was expected to be and who he actually was. Born in 1917 in Los Angeles, Richard Boone grew up in a world already shaped by expectations. His grandfather had been the legendary outlaw Daniel Boone, a name that carried mythic weight. From an early age, Richard understood that he came from a line of men remembered for strength, independence, and fearlessness. Weakness was not part of that legacy. As a boy, he learned quickly that emotion was something to be controlled, not displayed. Even his early interests reflected this tension. While he possessed a sharp intellect and a love for literature, philosophy, and history, he also felt compelled to project physical toughness. At Stanford University, where he studied, Boone was not merely a student, he was a man trying to build armor around himself. He read voraciously, debated fiercely, and absorbed ideas that would later shape his private worldview, but none of that fit the image Hollywood would later sell. The world didn't want a thinking cowboy, it wanted a fighter. World War II left its mark on Boone in ways he never openly discussed. Serving in the Navy, he experienced loss, fear, and disillusionment that would quietly follow him for the rest of his life. While many veterans spoke about camaraderie and heroism, Boone internalized the darker truths of war. He came back changed, but instead of unpacking that trauma, he buried it under discipline and control. This became a pattern that defined his double life. Publicly, he was composed and commanding. Privately, he wrestled with existential questions, anger, and a sense of alienation that never fully faded. Acting, at first, seemed like a way to channel that intensity, but it also became a trap. Hollywood rewarded his hardness and ignored his complexity. As Boone's career gained momentum in the 1950s, he quickly found himself typecast. Directors loved his physicality, his voice, his ability to dominate a scene without saying much. Audiences believed him instantly as a man capable of violence, authority, and moral certainty. What they didn't see was how calculated his performances were. Boone approached acting like an academic. He analyzed scripts deeply, studied motivations, questioned shallow writing, and often clashed with producers who wanted him to simply play tough. This created friction in his professional life. He wasn't difficult because he was arrogant, he was difficult because he cared too much. But that nuance was lost in an industry that preferred obedience over thoughtfulness. The success of Have Gun, Will Travel cemented Richard Boone as a television icon, but it also locked him into a persona that slowly suffocated him. Paladin was everything Boone appeared to be: educated, dangerous, self-controlled, and morally ambiguous. What audiences didn't realize was that Boone had poured enormous pieces of his private self into the role. Paladin's intelligence mirrored Boone's own, his solitude reflected Boone's isolation, and his quiet melancholy echoed feelings Boone rarely expressed aloud. The show made him famous, wealthy, and respected, but it also trapped him. For over 6 years, Boone lived in two worlds. One was the glamorous public life of a television star. The other was a private existence filled with books, intense political opinions, philosophical debates, and growing frustration with the entertainment industry. Behind closed doors, Boone was nothing like the caricature people imagined. He was deeply intellectual, often intense, and sometimes emotionally volatile. He could be generous and warm one moment, distant and cutting the next. He struggled with relationships because intimacy required vulnerability, something he had trained himself to avoid. His marriages reflected this inner conflict. While he desired companionship and understanding, he also feared being truly seen. Those closest to him sensed there was always something he was holding back, a layer he refused to peel away. This wasn't deception, it was survival. Alcohol became both a refuge and a problem. He was not alone in this, as Hollywood in that era quietly normalized heavy drinking, especially among men expected to project strength. For Boone, alcohol dulled the relentless noise in his mind. It softened the edges of anger, disappointment, and intellectual restlessness. But it also deepened his isolation. Publicly, drinking was brushed off as part of his rugged image. Privately, it fueled mood swings, strained relationships, and moments of self-loathing. Still, Boone maintained control enough to keep his career intact, reinforcing the illusion that he had everything under control. What truly defined Boone's double life was his secret dissatisfaction with fame itself. While many actors chased bigger roles, awards, and public adoration, Boone grew increasingly disillusioned. He resented shallow scripts, corporate interference, and the lack of artistic risk. He wanted stories with substance, characters with contradictions, and narratives that challenged audiences. This led him to make unconventional career choices, including producing his own projects and taking roles that confused fans. To the public, these decisions seemed erratic. In reality, they were acts of quiet rebellion. In the 1960s and 1970s, Boone withdrew more and more from mainstream Hollywood. He moved frequently, spent time abroad, and gravitated towards smaller, more experimental productions. To outsiders, it looked like a star fading away, but to Boone, it was a deliberate escape. He was trying to reclaim control over his identity, to live as a thinker rather than a symbol. During this period, he became more outspoken politically and intellectually, though still largely in private circles. He questioned authority, criticized American foreign policy, and expressed skepticism towards institutions he felt manipulated public perception. These views were rarely shared publicly, as they conflicted with his conservative, tough guy image. Even as his health declined later in life, Boone refused to soften his public persona. He didn't grant sentimental interviews or indulge in nostalgia. He remained guarded, sharp-tongued, and fiercely independent. Yet those who spent time with him in his final years noticed moments of reflection and quiet honesty. He spoke about regrets, not about fame, but about emotional distance. He acknowledged that his armor had protected him professionally, but cost him personally. This was the truth that emerged only at the end. Richard Boone wasn't hiding a scandal, he was hiding vulnerability. When Boone passed away in 1981, tributes focused on his toughness, his iconic roles, and his commanding presence. Very few mentioned the internal battles he fought for decades. The man remembered by history was only half the story. The other half, the thinker, the skeptic, the emotionally guarded intellectual, remained largely invisible. It wasn't until years later, through accounts from colleagues, family members, and re-examinations of his work, that the fuller picture began to emerge. Richard Boone had lived a double life not because he wanted to deceive the world, but because the world only made room for one version of him. And that is the quiet tragedy of Richard Boone's story. For 30 years, he carried two identities in the same body, the legend and the man. One was celebrated, the other was endured, and only now, long after the cameras stopped rolling, do we begin to understand just how much of himself he had to hide to survive.